Hello, everyone. So somehow the last video got cut off, so I'm just going to pick up where I left off. And I was just discussing the four tools of monetary policy that the Fed uses. So throughout Chapter 9 and 10, I thought this was maybe the most complex or complicated portion. So I just wanted to go over these supply and demand graphs with you all and go through each of these four tools. So the first would be the case where the Fed has what they call an open market operations. Part of that is either buying or selling bonds to or from the bank. So a buy case one. So first, I think I might have mentioned this in the last video, but I'll just say it again here. So these don't look like just a normal supply and demand with a downward sloping demand and upward sloping supply. So first of all, the supply curve is actually perfectly vertical. That is because the Fed doesn't operate for profit. So obviously, traditionally it slopes upward because as the price goes up, each business wants to sell more or they want to supply more of whatever they're selling. But in this case, the Fed is supplying the reserves or the money, but they don't have a profit motive. So they are just simply trying to promote the health of the economy. So that's why it's vertical. And also, as you can see, it is cut off here where it becomes horizontal. This is because it is limited by this ID here, which is the discount rate, or the rate that the Fed charges each bank to loan money from them. Now, on the other hand, this demand curve obviously sloping downwards, which looks normal. But then if you look down here, again, it is limited in a similar way, except this time it is by this IOR in the book, or that is the, I can't think of what it's called now, but essentially that is on reserves. That's what the OR stands for. So that is what the Fed would pay the banks to keep money on reserves. So that would be in the same manner that if you deposit money in Fifth Third or whatever bank, and they will pay you a small interest rate on that. So that's why it's limited by those two. So the first buy case is, actually, let me just back up here. So each case I'm going to show you where the Fed wants to have what we called a easing monetary policy, or essentially they want to help out the economy. So the reason I'll go over those is because that's usually what they do. So if times are good, everything's fine. They don't really want to act too much. But if times are bad, like the housing crisis or more recently with COVID, they want to use an easing monetary policy. And sometimes as things get better, then they might implement some of this tightening stuff. But again, especially in the last couple decades, we've seen a lot more of the easing. But the point here is, obviously, each of these examples, I'll show you that they are lowering the federal funds rate, which would be, to hopefully get the economy moving more. But of course, the opposite can be true here. So if the buy case one, the Fed is buying bonds from the banks. So because of that, they are giving money to the banks or reserves. So they are increasing the supply of reserves. So as you can see with these arrows here, it is shifts the supply curve to the right. So like I just said, obviously if it was a sell, it would shift to the left. But the first equilibrium before the buy would be at 1 here. And then, of course, it moves to 2 as the supply curve shifts to the right and lowers the interest rate, or the federal funds rates, excuse me. So that's case one, buy case one. So in the second case, because of this downward limit here, if the supply curve to begin with is already where 1 is, and they do the same thing, then it moves to 2, it doesn't change it doesn't lower the federal funds rate because it's limited by that. So essentially in this case 2, this is not an option for them because it doesn't stimulate the economy. It does not lower the federal funds rate. So because of this, perhaps they can try something else. So if they're stuck in this spot, that's not something they can do essentially to speed up the economy. So moving to 2, discount lending. So essentially they want to, by doing this, they want to lower the discount rate. So as I just mentioned, the discount rate here is what is the limiting on the top side. So what they can do is lower that. And if you look at the orange, if they limit it just that much, it's not doing anything because that orange line does not intersect with the blue demand line. So they have to lower that discount rate enough to where it touches this blue line here, or the green arrow. So of course, as you can see, again, we would be at 1 before this happened, and then by lowering that discount rate, we would move to 0.2, and again, this would also lower the equilibrium federal funds rate. And this would be at the point where the federal funds rate equals the discount rate. So that could be an alternative to lowering the federal funds rate other than an open market purchase. Moving to example 3, this is to change the reserve requirements. So as I mentioned in the last video, what they call the reserve ratio is the amount of physical reserves the banks have to hold as a percentage of like their total assets. So currently it's at 10%. And they could lower that. So this is pretty straightforward. This one would, instead of affecting supply, they're actually affecting demand. So of course, if you are a bank and the Fed imposes a legal requirement on you to hold a certain amount, obviously that's going to determine what demand you have for those reserves. So by decreasing the reserve requirement, they do not have to keep as much on hand. They have a less demand for the reserves. So this would effectively shift this from the blue, shift to the left. And again, here, if we were at 1, it would move us to 2. And again, it would go from the 1 federal funds rate down to 2. And I put scary here because we don't see this happen very often, just because it would bring bad publicity and also could trigger sort of a run on the bank. So of course, even at 10%, if everybody went and wanted to withdraw all of their money at the same time, the banks literally don't have the money to do that. So that would not be good. And so if the Fed announced today that they're lowering it from 10% to 2%, that would probably scare investors as well as just average people who, obviously have bank accounts, which most everybody does, because they're essentially less of their money is actually in the bank if something bad happens and you want to go withdraw that money. And the last one is to change the interest on reserves. So this, so we've seen already that either essentially they can shift the supply curve, which is this first case. They can lower the discount rate, which is this top bar. They can shift the demand curve, or lastly, they can raise this bottom bar here, or lower it. So in this case, they're lowering it. So if we were at 1 here, suppose this is the original spot, then they can lower that interest rate that they are paying the Fed, which would lower this floor here from 1 to 2. And again, it would lower the equilibrium federal funds rate. So obviously, if you look at this, it depends. This is again conditional on the fact that they're already hitting this floor here to begin with. So let's say this was the first point that they were already at here, and they lower it again, say down to here. Since supply doesn't shift, it doesn't intersect with supply, and that's not going to do anything. So again, these 4, what they may choose to use might depend on where this equilibrium point is currently at. But in reality, this first case here is what we see the most. And that's all I had for this chapter. So my intention was to put this all into one video, but since it cut off about halfway through last time, I will just mark the last one chapter 9, and then this one going over these supply and demand graphs as chapter 10.